There's going to be monumental consequences of just being in that survival mode. But what kids really need, from what I'm hearing from you, is that
not just something to be aware of, which is why some families actually decide to do the public school and to supplement with something outside, whether it's through their insurance or to go privately. But again, things that I couldn't say then that I can say now, which I think is really important to share, is that in public schools.
Hi guys, welcome back to Brewing Bright Minds. Miss Natalie Waldman has been with us at our school helping us support some of our students with speech services, and we just thought it would be amazing to have her join and bring her insight into the really loaded topic of speech language pathology. In your experience, I know we have seen a lot of consequences and for years how COVID has impacted our students in the classroom. What are some patterns that you have observed pre-pandemic and now with your clients, how they've been affected?
I think the big thing that we see overall is differences in social skills. I think that during the pandemic, there was less opportunity to socially interact with other kids. Many kids weren't going to preschool. And that was challenging. And so I think that a lot of it's social skills. And I think a lot of some of the differences that we're seeing is just there's some catch up to be done because children who would have been identifying as needing support during the pandemic may not have been identified during that time. And so it feels like the numbers are increasing in terms of who needs support. But I'm wondering if maybe a piece of that is because everybody was in emergency mode. Parents were doing the best that they could and working, and many times children were at home and they had to find a way to keep them, entertained or safe enough. And maybe that meant a lot of technology or TV time. And what we know is that children need a lot of stimulation from people. And so I think time will tell how it all shakes out, but the main things that I'm seeing that are different are social interactional skills and just like a backlog of kids who need support who maybe weren't identified during that time. What have you guys noticed in your school?
Honestly, I think the main thing that I have noticed in our school and just in general in the early childhood world is the language delay, because 5 years ago, I did not see as many language delays as I do now. And I'm not saying that it is from the pandemic, but it is just like you're saying, the pandemic happened, which was a really big thing in everybody's lives. And then just the advancement of technology has happened over the last 5 years, and just a lot of different, child-centered TV shows or child-centered YouTube videos and things like that. And it's a lot of childcare is a perfect example. A lot of families still don't have their children in childcare for the reason of what if it happens again, or all of the, the germs and sickness and things like that. If maybe
the fear behind it.
The fear, especially if there's somebody in the home who may be immune compromised or an underlying condition, and they don't want their children exposed. So they're at home and they're using technology more, like you said, or so I think the biggest thing is honestly the language.
And I think some of the limited research that I've read, of course, there's going to be more and more research coming out, is that there's a belief that maybe parental anxiety or caregiver anxiety has also contributed to some of the communication differences that we're seeing, right? If you're in emergency mode as the adult and the parent, your kids are feeling that, and you're more worried about putting food on the table and making sure your family's healthy. Like those are like Maslow's hierarchy is like, you got to take care of your most immediate needs before you can deal with the extras. And in that moment in time, maybe that extra is having time to talk to your child or take them places. It just wasn't always feasible. One interesting thing that I think has come up a lot is many parents and educators have asked me, do you think that masks contributed to speech or language delays? And so what I I think it's probably nuanced. I don't think there's going to be a yes or no because you can't account for all the other variables that were taking place. But what we do know is that blind children learn language in the same way as seeing children do. So we know that it's not because of watching the mouth. Now, it's more muffled, right? If you have a mask on, it's muffled. And maybe if you're predisposed to already having difficulty, it's certainly going to make it more difficult. When I work with children on their pronunciation of their language, it's really important for them to see my mouth because they need that extra input. For a child who is typically developing their communication, they might not need that extra support. So I think it'll be interesting to see what we learn over time. But I do think that, everybody was just doing their best during a really difficult time. And now we just have to do our best to support these children as best we can.
Especially because, the children in this time right now were born during the pandemic or just before, they grew up in it. So anyone under the age of 10, really, all of us, but really children under the age of 10 are, I think we're kind of, I don't want to say struggling, but we're watching them a little closely,
Yeah. And I suspect that a big piece of some of the communication differences is the increased reliance on technology during that time. And no shame again, everybody was just doing whatever they could to get through a really difficult time. But the American Academy of Pediatrics has some really helpful guidelines in terms of what types of technology and when to introduce them under typical ideal circumstances. And so I think technology in and of itself isn't problematic. However, it depends on the amount and the type of technology that a child's exposed to. And what we really see is the most important thing is that parents or caregivers are interacting while a child's engaging with technology. And that's kind of what takes it from a passive to more interactive and help support the communication. So
yes, absolutely. So it seems like the theme, which COVID kind of eliminated a lot of opportunities for that full-on engagement because we were working. We were at home, we were doing all the jobs at once. So absolutely. Mom and dad not necessarily on a screen with child because they lost out on that social piece and that eliminated so many opportunities for language development and those social skills. And so if you are with your child and not fully engaging with them and not promptly responding to them and having conversations with them, then it's going to limit their ability to learn and engage with others because we're kind of dual tasking
at
all the times.
And also just an important thing to note, not to make this about technology, but during the pandemic, most companies turned to working from home. And so now the parents were on screens all day.
Yes.
And so the children were seeing the parents on screens all day. And then, like you're saying, we're just doing our best to survive. And so maybe the child was having more screen time than usual. And now that's where 3 years post-pandemic is now we're all more addicted to screens.
Yes,
because
it's a new reality.
Yeah, children and adults alike, we're all more reliant on screens because of it.
So how do we now pull back a little bit and readjust ourselves now that we can, really carry on as a normal day-to-day, our normal day-to-day lives, but now give back to our family, give back to our kids what was lost, not by fault of anyone, but now it's the opportunity to, with those critical years, now let's give back as much as we can. Look at these signs, be aware of the resources we have, and really be mindful of the data they're using and what measures we should be using, and now kind of pour back into our kids so that early intervention is most important. So it's not too late. It's never too late.
Mm-hmm.
So giving that back so that their later years, they develop more typically, and hopefully, what we like to say is, if you provide that early intervention, it's as if that problem never existed, because now they're functioning just more typically and are happy and are able to communicate and do everything to the best of their ability that they wanted.
Yeah. And I think that often early intervention can really help kids catch up. And if they're unable to catch up, because that is the reality for some children, is that they won't, we're setting them up for success. And then to your point about just the children and how can we help them get back on track, I think kids are so resilient and we get to capitalize on neural plasticity. That's the brain's ability to grow and change and evolve. And in those early years, we can build some new connections. And so it's amazing what children, how they can bounce back from things when they're given the right supports. And I think you hit on such a good point to as is feasible for families, because sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, but as is feasible to try and pull back from the technology or be very mindful to interact while a child is engaged in technology. And again, the American Academy of Pediatrics has some good resources on that.
When parents are at home, what are some signs that they should be mindful of so that they can a red flag goes off and, okay, I should go seek speech services.
Given that their child is not in a center-based or school at all.
So you're talking about children like before they enter school, what kinds of things should
right? Or
parents
if
be
there's
looking
like
for?
a stay-at-home parent or maybe a babysitter or a nanny, maybe a child that doesn't have siblings, not around any other children.
So when we're talking about young children, some of the things we want to look for is that they are engaging with other people, that they show interest in others, that they respond to their name, and that we see that they're continuing to grow. So if they're using words, they're adding new words on a regular basis. If we ever see the child has a skill and loses a skill, whatever type of skill that may be, that is usually an indicator that we need to talk to a pediatrician or gather some more information. And so I think that guideline, when we're looking at just the vocabulary words, if we're looking at that minimum again of 50 words by 24 months, if your child's not there, that's the minimum expectation. So if they're not there at 24 months, it's a great idea to get some more information. And information's helpful, it's empowering, and it can be hard, and it can be scary, right, as parents, because you're worried, like, what am I going to find if I do some digging? And it can be reassuring that either your child's on track or you know exactly what's involved in helping them be the best that they can be. So those are some of the skills. I also, again, really like ASHA.org has some great guidelines by age, so very specific. So if your child is 13 months, you can look and see kind of where would I hope my child would be at, or what can I do to help, and when should I seek support? I think it's a good resource for more detailed
Perfect
kinds of things.
And then once they're ready to take on that journey to seek support, what are their options?
So it's such a good question, right? So maybe you're at home and you're thinking, oh, my child's quiet, or they're not really engaging with others, or they're not using that many words, or maybe they're a little older. Maybe your child's 3 and you're really not understanding them. You might be wondering, like, okay, so now what? So the first place we start is with an evaluation. Evaluation is just information gathering. How does your child do at home? If they're attending school, how do they do at school? How do they do on standardized testing? And then we gather all that information and determine if they appear to be developing on track or if they need additional support. So where can you go if you're a parent? So if your child is under 3, there is a nonprofit called the Regional Center. And our local one where we are is the RCOC, which is the Regional Center of Orange County. And they provide evaluations and therapy to families who qualify. And if you have financial hardship, they will step in.
Great.
So they're a great resource for if you have concerns about your child, you need an evaluation, and perhaps finances are a concern. They are a great resource to be aware of. If your child is 3 and up, you can obtain a free evaluation. It's covered by your taxpayer dollars through your local public school. Mm-hmm. In addition, there's other options, which include going through a private therapist such as myself. So basically, there's 2 directions that we can go when we're looking at getting support for a child. There's 2 different models. There's the educational model and the medical model. Mm-hmm. The educational model is once your child is 3 and up, it's getting services through the schools. That means an assessment or therapy if they qualify through your public school, your local public school. There's some pros and cons to that, which I'd be happy to walk through. But there's also the medical model. The medical model is you go to your doctor or provider, or maybe your teacher says, I think we need more information, and you opt to go either through your insurance or privately and get services, get an evaluation, and then therapy if it's warranted. Mm-hmm. And the educational model is looking at, can your child access their education? Mm-hmm. And so the criteria are very different, whereas the medical model is looking at, can your child fully participate in their day-to-day activities? Is this impeding? Is your child so frustrated that it's becoming difficult to get day-to-day things done? Mm-hmm. So we're looking at 2 different things. So in the public schools, it is wonderful that there's this free taxpayer-covered resource. The thing to be aware of, and I worked in the public schools, mm-hmm. There were a lot of things that we were not allowed to say. So mm-hmm. you are counseled. There are mm-hmm. meetings in which your legal counsel advises you as to what you may and may not say to parents. Mm-hmm. So the way that it works in the school district is, if you have a concern for your child, you can get in contact with your school district and say, I have concerns about my child's communication. Can you please evaluate him or her? The school district, I believe the current guidelines are they have 30 days to respond to your request, and then another 60 days to complete testing and hold a meeting with you to review the results. So if you're a parent who has concerns and maybe it's kind of snuck up on you and now it's mm-hmm. become more of a feeling of emergency, mm-hmm. that 3 months can be a long time to wait. Yes. But if you're not that concerned about timeline, or finances are a more of a driver, then you may want to wait that 3 mm-hmm. months and do it through the public school. So I really think it's a very individual choice, but I like to make parents aware of what their options are. Mm-hmm. So when you go through the schools, the thing to know is that a child only qualifies if their communication difficulties are impacting their access to education. Mm-hmm. So everybody in the United States is eligible for FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. So the obligation of the school is to make sure that a child can access their education. Your child has to be significantly behind mm-hmm. before the public schools will offer therapy. And so many times what that means is, when I worked on the schools, I would have to assess a child. And if they scored in the 7th percentile or below, they would qualify. So what that means is your child has to be in the bottom 7 most. So like mm-hmm. out of 100 kids, mm-hmm. your child has to be performing at the bottom 7 most mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
before we're going to offer them services. There are sometimes workarounds that creative therapists in the schools will use, where there's other ways that they can support that a child needs it. But again, things that I couldn't say then that I can say now, which I think is really important to share, is that in public schools, I can speak for speech therapists. It's an ongoing problem that our caseloads are very large. That means we're responsible for a lot of kids, and there's a lot of paperwork involved and a lot of meetings. Unfortunately, what that means is that when you're overwhelmed because there's so many hours in the day, and you really go in this profession because you want to help kids and you want to help their families. However, if a child is on the borderline of qualifying and you could go and do some extra work to get them on your caseload, you're not that inclined to do that when you're overwhelmed and don't even have time in your day. So that's just something in the back, the back end behind the screens that people might not.
So you're saying that even if they were at the cusp of qualifying for those services, more often than not, they may not, because you can't do the extra due diligence to help them qualify for it.
That's a common problem. I think nobody wants that to be the case. I don't think any therapist or school, frankly, like anybody who cares about kids and their education doesn't want that to be the case. But the burden is to prove that the child cannot access their education. It's not to say that they don't have difficulty, that they have difficulty accessing their education. So what you should know as a parent is that I sat in when your child is evaluated and you have that meeting to discuss the results, is called an IEP meeting. It stands for Individualized Education Plan. And that IEP meeting is if your child does qualify for services, then they outline what services your child is eligible for. So maybe speech therapy at the school 2 times a week, this amount of time, this many minutes. But you may also sit in one of those meetings and they may say your child does not qualify. So many times having these meetings, it was a very painful experience for me personally, because I was not legally allowed to say your child doesn't qualify, but you should definitely get some outside support, because the school district is on the hook for paying for those services if you say that. So we weren't allowed to say that. So what I think is really important for parents to know is the schools are a wonderful source of support, and schools are doing the best that they can. And for some kids, it is a great resource to be aware of. You can save money, and you can do it. If your child's attending a public school, they can reap those services if they qualify. But know that if your child doesn't qualify, it does not necessarily mean they don't need support. It just means their situation is not significant enough to be eligible for education. There comes the medical model. The medical model says, how's your child doing in terms of functioning day to day? And so those evaluations are done a little differently. If you're going in the medical model, you have the option to go through insurance or private. In the insurance route, your insurance is guiding what qualifies a child to receive services, as well as the frequency of services that your particular plan will cover. So unfortunately, again, when it comes to insurance, many plans are doing the best they can to not provide services. So it's really incumbent on a parent to call their insurance plan. I actually have a cheat sheet on my website that I shared with all parents that are considering services, where they can call their insurance provider and get really good information about like what's covered, how often, what situations. So for example, I'm a private therapist. I've opted to be private because it allows me to do what I feel is best for children and their families without insurance interfering. Like, I find that seeing children in their schools is a natural environment where they tend to feel more comfortable, where I can collaborate with teachers and educators, and then also with parents, so we get better results for children typically. Many insurance providers would not allow me to see a child in their home or in their school. So it's just, again, it's choice, and everybody has decisions that they need to make as to what works best for their family. So it's just good to know, if you go the medical route, you often need a referral from your pediatrician to go through your insurance to obtain evaluation and therapy. The pro of that, of course, is we have insurance. We want to be able to use it when we have health insurance. The con is there's many limitations, and also oftentimes when we're doing therapy in a clinic, so your child, let's say they're eligible for speech therapy, they go to a clinic. In order to make the financial numbers work, because insurance reimbursement continues to drop over time, making it unsustainable for many professionals continue to deliver services as they would like, it requires that many practices need to use a speech language pathology assistant to deliver services. So it's not a speech language pathologist. Now, is that per se a problem? Not necessarily. I have met SLPAs, that's an abbreviated version for speech language pathology assistant. I met SLPAs that are amazing. They know their stuff. They really do. And I've met SLPAs who have less experience or, and less education, and it can change the results of what your child receives. And so it's just something to be aware of. It isn't just like for parents to know. And there are a lot of things that you wouldn't know unless you have this conversation. Yes. And that leads to many parents opting to choose someone like me. I'm a private speech therapist. I don't take insurance. What I do is I provide an invoice called a super bill, and then parents submit it to their insurance to if they are eligible for what's called out-of-network reimbursement. So many families I work with are able to get some reimbursement that way, or families just opt to just pay because the insurance will cover so little, or they can't get in. The wait lists are really long. So I always tell parents, these are all the options that are available. The most important thing is that you get your child the support that they need, and just know the pros and cons of each and determine what works best for your family and your child and your situation.
So I think it's really important because that's just so much amazing information. There are so many options, maybe too many options in a sense. Yeah. But I think parents need to think about, where does my child lie in terms of the spectrum of the need. And so if it is and also it's individualized in terms of circumstances and financial burdens, honestly. And so it's a really tough decision. But my first question is, if they are going through the district and, like we talked about earlier, if they are on the cusp of qualifying, a lot of my students hire advocates. Is that something that can help them qualify? Advocates are someone that can help aid you in your IEP, so that to make sure your child can receive the services they need, but also that those accommodations are being implemented the way they need to be. Would an advocate be able to help that situation?
I think it really depends on the situation. I think if a child genuinely does not qualify, because in the school setting, they have to meet the educational criteria. And the goal is always what we call the least restrictive environment. So what that means is we don't want to take a child and put them, for example, in a special education classroom if they could be successful in a mainstream classroom with some additional support. So we're having to consider a lot of the laws around the educational system, and as well as, again, behind the scenes, what I can say now that I couldn't say then is like, what's the manpower?
Yes.
Or the women power a lot of times in school. So I think that an advocate is helpful if an IEP has been held, an individualized education plan is established, and perhaps it's not being adhered to. But I always think that the place to start is to try and partner with the speech language pathologist or the school in general. Like, start there and see if you can get your child the support they need, or get clarification, or make sure that things that have been agreed to are actually being adhered to, because it's a legally binding document. So, and if that's not the case and you can't make headway after making those attempts to partner, because I think that's, at the end of the day, like, let's all be there for the child. And sometimes when we bring in an advocate, it sends like it can lend to an adversarial feeling that may be warranted. Like, sometimes it is warranted. However, if the speech language pathologist has clearly shown that the child doesn't meet the criteria, then they may not meet the criteria despite their hands are tied. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that is really powerful, because at least you're giving us information for a parent's perspective in terms of a starting point. Because if you have concerns, and if you're under 3, then you can rely on the regional center.
Or me.
Or you. Private, in my experience, if you, in a perfect world, if you have the finances to be able to seek the best or the more efficient and more effective services, from my experience, private is the way to go, because private clinicians will operate in the best interest of your child without all of these obstacles getting in the way. And so if you are able to afford a private approach, then you are able to, it's just more efficient. You don't have to jump through loops and go through circles and fight your way to have your child receive the services they need. And you don't have to keep proving it. It's a relentless battle. And it's exhausting for parents and daunting for parents. And it's a long battle. And so somehow, if you do have the opportunity to get a private speech therapist, then they can pinpoint the problem immediately with the initial evaluation. They can look at it with a holistic approach as opposed to just an academic approach or a medical approach and just focusing on, certain areas, and really look at your child as a whole and pinpoint it and customize the approach to your child to hopefully have results in a certain amount of months to however long it may be, as opposed to fighting a relentless battle just to get services to start.
Yeah, it can be hard. And I think that insurance route can be wonderful, and the school route can be wonderful, and the private route can be wonderful. It just has to work for your family. And there's providers in all those areas that are outstanding. And just like anything, there's less outstanding.
Yes.
But I think, that 0 to 3 population, there's a regional center, and then there's the insurance route, and then there's the private route. And I think, to add to what you were saying about why private is helpful for those for whom it works, is just the flexibility and the convenience.
Yes.
So like in my case, I travel to private schools because private schools don't have those services available on campus. And so having someone be able to come in allows us to partner and get those children what they need, or going in home to people's home where the child feels comfortable and the parents are doing their everyday thing and they get that support in real time. I think it just allows for some flexibility that some of the other options don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also you get to really get a program that is effective, because even if you do qualify from my understanding through the district, it may be 2 times a week for 20-30 minutes.
If you're lucky. And so the other thing,
and that's
well, it depends what the problem is what I would say, because depending on what the problem is, there's research to support different numbers of minutes and what's going to be effective. So I'll say that. But aside from that, what I can tell you now that I couldn't say then when I worked in the public schools is that because the caseloads are high, meaning we have a lot of students to see, we have to group them in bigger groups in order, because again, an IEP, an individualized education plan, is a legally binding document. So the obligation is to see the child for so many minutes. But what that means is I'm sharing that time. If I'm having a group of 3 or 4 or 5 students, and I'm having to get them from the room and take them back from the room, even if it's, let's say, 30 minutes, by the time I've gotten all the kids and taken them all back and seated them and got them going, I started to think to myself when I was working this with, how many minutes did that child actually get of services, of support? And I did the best I could, as do lots of SLPs in the schools. We would talk on the way to, and we work on their goals on the way to and from their classroom in less formal ways. And we would sit them down and we'd come up with as efficient processes as we could. But the reality is, yes, your child may receive the services and some may be outstanding. And much of the time, people are just doing the best they can with really limited time and resources. And that's just something to be aware of, which is why some families actually decide to do the public school and to supplement with something outside, whether it's through their insurance or to go privately.
Yes. So parents just really need to gauge and keep a pulse on, is it effective? Am I getting the results that I want within reason over time? If not, then it's great to supplement. It doesn't hurt to have it at school and also supplement. So that's great. So it's up to the parents to really look at the whole picture and make changes as we go, of course, as you collect that data. Well, this was wonderful, Natalie. Thank you so much. We could have probably stayed here
for hours.
For 5 more hours to cover more and more and more. It's an endless conversation. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for providing so many different resources and things to be mindful of. And we hope to bring you back sometime later in the future.
Well, thank you guys for having me. It's been so much fun. I feel like we covered a lot, and we are still basically scratching the surface. But I hope that parents and educators will find it helpful.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Brewing Bright Minds podcast. Hopefully, this information was beneficial and helpful and as insightful as we feel it is. Please feel free to connect with us. Please leave comments, subscribe, and please share your experiences and any ideas you have to engage in this dialogue.